Dawn breaks over the Pacific with deceptive calm. The ocean below reflects a pale, indifferent light, while above it the sky already feels occupied, claimed by aircraft that climb faster, turn tighter, and arrive first. For the men lifting off from carrier decks that morning, the horizon does not promise opportunity. It warns of imbalance. Somewhere ahead, unseen but expected, enemy fighters already hold the altitude that decides survival. For American Grumman Wildcats begin their climb. The ascent is slow, deliberate, almost heavy. Each foot of altitude is purchased with time they do not have. The pilots know the arithmetic before the engines reach full power. They are fewer in number, inferior in speed, and burdened by physics that cannot be negotiated. There is no illusion of surprise, only the certainty of being late to a fight already forming. The Mitsubishi Zero enters their awareness not as a shape in the sky, but as an idea. It exists first as reputation, lightweight, agile, untouchable. It is spoken of less as a machine than as a conclusion already drawn. The Zero is what happens when theory and confidence align. It represents an assumption that the air itself will cooperate. Inside the cockpits, radios crackle with short, controlled transmissions. There is no bravado. No speeches. Only headings, altitudes, fuel states. Words are weighed carefully, as if excess syllables might invite error. Each pilot understands that discipline, not courage, is the only margin they possess. Before a single round is fired, the imbalance is registered. It is felt in the climb rate, in the wide arc required to turn, in the knowledge that escape will not come from maneuver. I scan the sky not for targets, but for threats already expected to be there. This is recognition, not panic. The training manuals offer no reassurance. Diagrams of ideal engagements dissolve under the weight of reality. The Wildcat was never meant to dominate the air, it was meant to survive it. That distinction matters now. Procedures written in peacetime feel distant, almost abstract, against the immediacy of an enemy who has already rewritten the rules. And so the opening truth settles in, quietly and without argument. By every measure that matters, speed, climb, agility, this fight should not be winnable. The sky belongs to someone else. What remains unanswered is whether belief alone can decide that ownership, or whether the air still has lessons left to teach. On paper, the comparison is unforgiving. The Grumman Wildcat is slower in level flight, slower in the climb, and wider in every turn it attempts. Its engine strains for altitude that the enemy reaches with ease. Where the Wildcat relies on mass and structure, the Japanese Zero sheds weight wherever possible, trading protection for performance. In the language of aerodynamics, the outcome seems already written. Across the Pacific, Japanese naval aviation doctrine has validated those numbers with results. From China to the opening months of the war, the Zero has carved a reputation built on first contact and decisive finish. Engagements end quickly, often before opponents understand what went wrong. Maneuverability is not treated as an advantage, it is treated as inevitability. The doctrine works because it has not yet been challenged. Survivors tell the story more clearly than reports ever could. They describe attacks that arrive from above and behind, turns that cannot be matched, and an enemy that seems to vanish the moment retaliation is attempted. These accounts do not dramatize defeat, they catalogue it. The pattern is consistent enough to be instructive and grim enough to be believed. The Zero's reputation spreads faster than intelligence briefings. It moves through ready rooms and carrier decks as a warning passed quietly between pilots. Not exaggerated, not embellished, just accepted. By the time formal assessments arrive, belief has already filled the gaps. The aircraft is assumed to be unbeatable because it has not yet been beaten. Each American pilot understands, privately and without complaint, that skill alone will not close the gap. Experience can sharpen judgment, but it cannot shorten a turn radius. Courage can steady hands, but it cannot add horsepower. There is a limit to what training can overcome when the machine itself defines the boundaries of possibility. The battlefield, they realize, is not neutral. It favors one side heavily, not through chance, but through design. Every engagement begins tilted, every mistake punished asymmetrically. The air itself seems to collaborate with one aircraft over the other, rewarding confidence and exposing hesitation. And so a question emerges, quietly and without resolution. What happens when technology decides outcomes before men can intervene? If superiority is engineered rather than earned, where does adaptation begin, and how long does belief remain an asset before it becomes a liability? The answer has not yet revealed itself. But the equation, for now, remains unequal. The Wildcats draw together in the sky, tightening their formation until each aircraft feels uncomfortably close to the next. It is not instinct that holds them there, but understanding. Separation means exposure, and exposure means death. In this airspace, distance is not freedom, it is vulnerability. The formation becomes a single decision maintained by constant adjustment and neutral awareness. Every calculation now runs against time. Fuel is checked and rechecked, measured not in miles but in minutes. Altitude is weighed against engine strain. Ammunition is counted not for victory, but for endurance. Nothing is wasted. Nothing is assumed. The pilots understand that the margin for error has already been spent. Somewhere above them, the enemy holds initiative. The Zero pilots choose when to engage, from what angle, and with how much advantage. They see first, descend faster, and retreat at will. Confidence accompanies them like an additional instrument, quiet, unquestioned, reinforcing every decision. The Wildcats do not contest this reality. They work within it. As contact becomes inevitable, command authority narrows to one voice. There is no room for debate, no time for consensus. Orders are brief, precise, and final. The formation responds as one body, not for individuals. Leadership here is not about inspiration, it is about reducing complexity when complexity kills. Individual survival gives way to collective discipline. Each pilot accepts that his safety depends less on his own hands than on the position of the aircraft beside him. The instinct to break away, to turn harder or climb faster, is deliberately suppressed. Discipline replaces impulse, and restraint becomes the only form of control left to them. Fear is present, but it is contained. It sharpens perception rather than overwhelming it. The pilots feel it in the tension of their grip, in the narrowing of focus, in the heightened awareness of sound and motion. Fear is converted into attention, and attention becomes their most reliable instrument. Below them, the ocean stretches out, indifferent and unchanged. Above them, the sky waits, already measured and judged by others. The Wildcats hold formation as the first distant shapes begin to resolve. The stage is set, not for a fair fight, but for a contest whose outcome has already been predicted. What remains uncertain is whether prediction itself can be challenged, or whether belief will prove as decisive as firepower. Japanese naval aviation doctrine is built on a single, uncompromising premise: agility decides combat. Before the war, this belief is refined into orthodoxy. Aircraft are designed to climb quickly, turn tightly, and respond instantly to pilot input. Protection is sacrificed willingly. Speed and maneuver become virtues not just of design, but of identity. In this framework, survival belongs to the aircraft that controls the geometry of the sky. Pre-war victories appear to confirm the logic. In China and the opening campaigns of the Pacific, Japanese pilots encounter opponents unable to contest their movements. Engagements end decisively, often within moments. These results are studied, repeated, and internalized. Each success reinforces the conviction that maneuverability is not merely advantageous, it is destiny expressed through engineering. The Zero emerges as the purest expression of that philosophy. It is not admired only for its performance, but for what it represents. Lightweight, responsive, and elegant in form, it becomes proof that the doctrine is correct. The aircraft validates the thinking that created it. To fly the Zero is to inhabit certainty, to feel aligned with the principles that govern victory. Enemy pilots enter combat expecting the sky to behave predictably. Physics, they believe, will comply. An opponent that turns wider or climbs slower is assumed to be finished the moment it is engaged. The Zero's pilots trust that their aircraft will always provide an escape or an opening. decision-making becomes faster, simpler, and increasingly automatic. American aircraft are categorized before the fight even begins. Heavier, slower, visibly burdened by armor and structure, they are dismissed as remnants of an outdated philosophy. There is no expectation that such machines can adapt. They are understood as obstacles to be removed, not problems to be solved. Confidence streamlines thought, but it also narrows it. When outcomes feel assured, questions seem unnecessary. Pilots rely on habits that have always worked, repeating patterns without re-evaluation. Nuance is overlooked because it has never been required. The very efficiency of belief becomes its weakness. Superiority, reinforced by experience and doctrine, hardens into certainty. And certainty, once fixed, resists adjustment. The Zero's pilots carry that assurance with them into every engagement, unaware that belief itself is becoming a liability. Somewhere ahead, a different interpretation of the sky is taking shape, one that does not depend on agility alone and does not require faith to function. U.S. Navy doctrine enters the war carrying its own convictions. Faced with aircraft that outperform them in speed and agility, planners assume that endurance and numbers will compensate over time. Attrition is treated not as failure, but as strategy. Losses are expected, absorbed, and justified as the price of slowing an enemy long enough for industrial strength to assert itself. Armor and durability are emphasized as safeguards rather than solutions. The Wildcat is designed to bring its pilot home when lighter aircraft would not. Self-sealing fuel tanks, reinforced structure, and redundant systems reflect a belief that survival itself is a form of success. These features are valued not because they win fights, but because they allow pilots to fight again. The Wildcat, in this framework, is not expected to dominate the sky. It is expected to endure it. Its purpose is to withstand damage, return fire when possible, and remain controllable under punishment. Victory is redefined as persistence. The aircraft becomes a platform for resilience rather than a tool for decisive maneuver. Commanders accept losses as the cost of time. Each engagement is measured less by immediate outcome than by delay imposed on the enemy. The calculus is strategic, not personal. Squadrons are expended to hold ground or airspace until replacements and better machines arrive. This logic is rational, but it carries a weight that settles unevenly on those asked to execute it. Pilots are taught survival first. Training emphasizes formation discipline, controlled withdrawal, and damage management. Heroics are discouraged. Individual triumph is considered less valuable than returning with experience intact. Victory, when it comes, is expected to be incremental and impersonal. Under pressure, tactical imagination narrows. When expectations are managed downward, innovation feels risky. Pilots focus on minimizing loss rather than seeking advantage. The boundary between realism and resignation becomes difficult to distinguish. Gradually, a quiet acceptance settles in. The Wildcat is understood as outmatched, its role defined by limitation. The assumption is not that the situation will change in the air, but that it will change elsewhere through production, time, and replacement. What remains unexamined is whether belief itself is shaping outcomes, and whether endurance, when mistaken for inevitability, is silently closing the door to adaptation. Two air forces rise to meet each other carrying truths that cannot coexist. Each has been shaped by experience, reinforced by success, and hardened by repetition. One believes that agility governs the sky, that victory belongs to the aircraft that can bend physics more tightly than its opponent. The other trusts endurance, that survival, multiplied over time, will outweigh immediate loss. Both convictions feel earned. Neither feels provisional. The Japanese pilot enters combat with faith in maneuver. He expects to dictate the terms of engagement through speed and turn, to impose his will by geometry alone. The American pilot arrives with confidence of a different kind. He believes his aircraft will absorb punishment, that discipline will compensate for disadvantage, and that persistence will matter more than brilliance. Each belief simplifies the chaos of combat into something manageable. What neither side questions is belief itself. Assumptions are treated as constants rather than variables. Doctrine becomes habit, and habit becomes reflex. There is no pause to consider whether conviction might also be constraint, whether certainty narrows the field of vision as much as fear ever could. The sky becomes a proving ground not just for machines, but for ideas. Every engagement tests which assumptions survive contact with reality. Yet those tests are interpreted selectively. Success confirms doctrine. Failure is explained away as circumstance. The possibility that the framework itself might be flawed remains unexamined. Confidence accelerates decisions. It shortens deliberation and sharpens action, but it also compresses judgment. When outcomes feel predictable, caution seems unnecessary. Maneuvers are repeated because they have always worked. Responses are anticipated because they have always been the same. In that predictability, space opens quietly for surprise. What has proven effective before is repeated without reflection. Patterns harden. Pilots on both sides begin to expect not just certain outcomes, but certain behaviors from their enemy. The air war acquires rhythm, almost routine, even as lives continue to be lost within it. Unnoticed, the conditions for reversal begin to form. Not through superiority of numbers or sudden invention, but through observation. Within repetition, anomalies appear. Within certainty, cracks emerge. Somewhere between agility and endurance, between confidence and resignation, a different answer is beginning to take shape, one that neither side has yet fully recognized, and one that belief alone will not be able to stop. The early encounters unfold exactly as feared. Contact is brief, violent, and decisive. Zeros arrive from superior altitude, cutting down through the formation with confidence born of repetition. Wildcats respond as trained, but the response is already behind the moment. The imbalance predicted in briefings and whispered on carrier decks now expresses itself in smoke and falling aircraft. When Wildcats attempt to fight the Zeros' fight, the outcome is swift. Pilots tighten turns they cannot complete, bleed speed they cannot afford, and expose themselves in the hope that skill might compensate for physics. It does not. The Zero slips inside their arcs with ease, firing from positions that offer no reply. These are not heroic mistakes, they are logical ones, made under assumptions that no longer apply. Those who survive learn quickly. There is little time for analysis in the air, but patterns assert themselves through repetition. Pilots begin to recognize the sequence of attack, the angles favored, the moment when pursuit becomes invitation. Survival sharpens memory. What nearly killed them becomes impossible to forget. After-action reports describe not chaos, but predictability. The same maneuvers recur. The same vulnerabilities are exploited. Engagements differ in detail, but not in structure. Losses follow a logic that can be traced if one is willing to look without defensiveness. The enemy is not improvising. He is executing doctrine with consistency. Despite casualties, formations hold. Discipline asserts itself even as aircraft vanish from position. Pilots resist the urge to scatter, understanding that isolation would only accelerate defeat. Commands are acknowledged. Spacing is maintained. The structure remains intact long enough to absorb punishment without dissolving into panic. Each loss sharpens observation. What once felt overwhelming begins to resolve into components, angles, timing, expectations. The Zero strengths are undeniable, but they are also specific. Pilots begin to notice what the enemy does repeatedly and what he does not do at all. These details are small, easily missed, but they accumulate. Defeat, relentless and unembellished, begins teaching faster than manuals ever could. Instruction written in abstraction gives way to lessons written in experience. The cost is high, but the education is precise. Somewhere within the wreckage of early encounters, understanding is forming not yet a solution, but a direction. And as losses mount, the question quietly shifts from whether the Wildcat can survive to whether survival itself might be used as a weapon. At some point, pursuit loses its appeal. The Wildcats stop chasing silhouettes across the sky and begin watching them instead. Attention shifts from instinct to observation. The impulse to follow is replaced by the discipline to wait. In that restraint, the fight slows just enough for understanding to enter. The Zero strengths, so overwhelming at first contact, begin to show repetition. Attacks arrive from familiar angles, follow predictable arcs, and withdraw along established paths. The enemy relies on advantage with confidence, trusting that no response will arrive from certain positions. What once appeared fluid now reveals structure. Victory, the pilots realize, will not come from turning tighter or climbing harder. Those contests are already decided. Instead, it will depend on denying opportunity, refusing the enemy the conditions his doctrine requires. This is not aggression, but subtraction. Remove the advantage, and the outcome becomes negotiable. Altitude takes on new meaning. It is no longer simply a position to defend or surrender, but a resource to be managed collectively. Spacing within the formation becomes deliberate, calibrated to mutual coverage rather than individual escape. Timing replaces speed as the decisive factor. Seconds matter more than knots. Communication grows in importance as aggression recedes. Short calls, warnings, and confirmations bind the formation together. A sighting shared is an advantage multiplied. Silence becomes dangerous. The radio, once secondary to maneuver, becomes the spine of coordination. Under sustained pressure, patterns sharpen. The Zero commits fully once it dives, expecting isolation at the point of attack. It lingers just long enough to secure a kill, then climbs away. That moment, brief, confident, and exposed, begins to stand out. It is not a flaw in the machine, but in the expectation that no one will be waiting. Insight forms quietly, almost reluctantly. Desperation has stripped away ornament and pride, leaving only function. The pilots do not yet have a name for what they are discovering, only the sense that something simple is taking shape. The solution will not come from matching the enemy's brilliance, but from constraining it. And somewhere ahead, that insight will demand structure, something rigid enough to hold under pressure, and simple enough to survive fear. Amid the pressure of repeated losses, one commander steps back from the noise of engagement and reframes the problem. He does not ask for greater courage or sharper instincts. He asks a simpler question: how space itself is being used. To him, the fight is not a contest of will, but of geometry. Angles, distances, and timing matter more than bravado ever could. He stops thinking of for aircraft as for fighters. Instead, he sees them as a single structure in motion, its shape defined by relative position rather than individual intent. When one aircraft turns, the others must respond. When one climbs or descends, the geometry of the whole changes. Survival, in this view, depends on maintaining that structure under stress. The Wildcats' weaknesses, so often lamented, begin to serve a purpose. Its slower turn and heavier frame discourage impulsive maneuver. What once felt like limitation now enforces discipline. The aircraft resists reckless movement, compelling pilots to remain predictable to each other. Constraint becomes coherence. From this perspective, a simple image forms. Not a complex diagram or theoretical construct, but a visual metaphor that can be understood instantly. For aircraft aligned and rotating, rigid but responsive. A matchstick, straight, inflexible, and unbroken unless snapped apart. The idea is not elegant. It is practical. The tactic is explained plainly, without flourish or rhetoric. Each pilot is responsible not for chasing the enemy, but for guarding the space of another. Turns are made together. Fire is delivered not in pursuit, but in defense. The goal is not to win the fight, but to survive it intact long enough for the enemy's confidence to carry him too far. Heroism is deliberately removed from the equation. There is no room for individual triumph, no allowance for improvisation. Survival is emphasized as the only objective that matters. If survival is achieved, opportunity may follow. If not, nothing else does. Innovation arrives without ceremony. There is no announcement, no doctrine rewritten, no recognition of significance. It is simply a decision to try something different, born of necessity and shaped by observation. In the sky ahead, the next engagement waits. And within it, this untested geometry will soon be measured, not by theory, but by fire. The Wildcats draw into position with deliberate precision. For aircraft align into a rigid shape, each maintaining exact distance, each turn measured and shared. The formation begins to rotate slowly, not in pursuit of the enemy, but around its own center. It is defensive in nature, but not passive. The sky around them is divided into zones of responsibility, every angle accounted for. Each aircraft now exists to protect another. A blind spot for one becomes a firing lane for the next. There is no forward edge, no rear, no vulnerable flank, only continuity. The pilots fight the urge to break formation, trusting the structure rather than instinct. It feels unnatural, even exposed. But it holds. Above them, a Zero commits to the attack. The dive is confident, familiar, executed as it has been dozens of times before. The enemy pilot expects separation at the point of contact, of one Wildcat peeling away, another hesitating, the formation dissolving under pressure. Physics has always rewarded this moment. This time, it does not. Instead of isolation, the Zero enters a rotating wall of converging fire. As it passes through one aircraft's arc, it is immediately met by another. Traces intersect where empty air was expected. The moment stretches just long enough for recognition and then collapses into violence. The geometry does the work. The Zero speed carries it forward, but its agility finds nothing to exploit. Every turn exposes it to another gun. Every correction tightens the trap. Overconfidence, once an advantage, now becomes momentum without exit. The Wildcat pilots do not chase. They do not break formation. They hold the rotation, trusting the structure to finish what discipline has begun. The Zero, designed to dance through space, finds itself denied space entirely. Agility, stripped of opportunity, becomes meaningless. The enemy aircraft shudders, then breaks apart. Pieces fall away, trailing smoke, spiraling toward the ocean below. There is no cheer, no exclamation over the radio. The moment is registered quietly, almost clinically. But it is unmistakable. The first Zero falls not through superior speed or sharper maneuver, but through denial. Through structure. Through a refusal to play the expected role. In that instant, something fundamental shifts. The sky does not change hands completely, but ownership is no longer assumed. The formation continues its rotation, intact and controlled. Ahead, more enemy fighters circle, uncertain now, reassessing what they thought they understood. The matchstick has been struck once. Whether it will hold under repeated pressure remains unknown. But for the first time, the Wildcats are no longer reacting to belief. They are rewriting it. The next attacks follow quickly, driven by habit as much as necessity. Zeros dive again, testing the formation from different angles, expecting it to fracture under repetition. It does not. The Wildcats maintain their disciplined rotation, each turn synchronized, each field of fire overlapping. What worked moments ago works again, not through chance, but through consistency. The Zero's advantages begin to evaporate. Speed still exists, agility still matters, but neither can be translated into position. There is no exposed flank to exploit, no isolated aircraft to single out. The very qualities that once ensured dominance now deliver pilots repeatedly into prepared fire. Physics, stripped of mythology, asserts its limits. For the first time, hesitation appears. Enemy pilots pull away earlier, break off dives mid-commitment, circle instead of striking. Confidence, once automatic, now requires calculation. In that pause, the air war changes character. The initiative no longer belongs to the attacker alone. The Wildcats absorb damage and remain in the fight. Rounds tear into wings and fuselages, but the aircraft hold together. Engines continue to run. Controls respond. The formation flexes but does not fail. What was designed for endurance now fulfills its purpose, not as consolation, but as leverage. Mutual protection replaces individual maneuver as the dominant logic of survival. No pilot attempts to outfly the enemy. Each accepts his role as part of a whole. Trust replaces improvisation. The formation itself becomes the weapon, enforcing behavior on both sides. Under these conditions, doctrine collapses. The assumptions that once governed Japanese attacks no longer produce results. Maneuvers perfected over years lose their relevance when the enemy refuses to separate. There is no immediate counter, no adjustment that restores certainty. The myth of invincibility dissolves not through defeat alone, but through confusion. The sky changes ownership moment by moment. Control is no longer absolute, but contested, negotiated through position and patience. The Wildcats do not dominate the air, but they deny it to the enemy. Each failed attack reinforces the shift, making belief harder to sustain. As the engagement continues, the lesson deepens. Superiority built on assumption cannot survive exposure to structure. Physics favors neither arrogance nor despair, it favors alignment. And in this alignment, forged under pressure, the balance of the fight tilts not through brilliance, but through refusal to yield space. Ahead, that refusal will echo beyond this encounter, carried by pilots who have seen certainty break apart in midair. The engagements multiply, and with them, a pattern emerges. What began as a single experiment repeats itself across the sky. Zeros commit to attacks expecting collapse, and instead encounter resistance that does not break. The outcomes are no longer isolated incidents. They are consistent enough to demand attention. Loss ratios begin to reverse expectations. Wildcats still take damage, still fall, but not at the rate once assumed. Zeros, previously untouchable, are now lost with unsettling regularity. The numbers do not yet favor the Americans in absolute terms, but they no longer obey the old equation. The imbalance that defined the opening month starts to erode. Japanese pilots withdraw more frequently. Dives are aborted. Attacks are broken off before firing solutions are achieved. Survival, once assumed, now requires judgment. The confidence that carried them into every engagement now demands verification. Withdrawal becomes a rational choice rather than an unthinkable one. Those who survive report not defeat, but confusion. They describe formations that refuse to scatter, fire that arrives from unexpected angles, and enemies that do not behave as anticipated. The language of their reports shifts. Certainty gives way to questions. Doctrine offers no immediate explanation. American confidence stabilizes, but it does not inflate. There is no surge of bravado, no illusion of superiority. Pilots understand that the margin remains thin, that discipline must be maintained without exception. The lesson is not that the Wildcat is suddenly dominant, but that it can be effective when used collectively and without deviation. The tactic spreads not through orders, but through observation. Pilots watch one another survive engagements that once guaranteed loss. They copy what works. There are no manuals, no formal briefings. The sky itself becomes the classroom. Adaptation moves faster than command. What began as a local solution now carries wider implications. A formation conceived out of necessity begins to influence how engagements are approached elsewhere. It does not end the threat, nor does it erase disparity. But it alters the rhythm of the air war. The enemy no longer owns the initiative by default. For aircraft against many was never meant to be decisive. Yet in its restraint and simplicity, it begins reshaping expectations. The war in the air does not turn on spectacle, but on accumulation of insight, of discipline, of refusal. And as this lesson travels outward, it prepares the ground for changes still to come, far beyond the reach of these first rotating formations. When the fighting subsides, the record that remains is unadorned. Combat reports arrive stripped of flourish, written in the spare language of pilots and officers accustomed to loss. They note formations held, attacks repelled, aircraft damaged but recovered. The shift is evident not in rhetoric, but in ratios and repetition. What stands out is not triumph, but consistency, outcomes that no longer conform to expectation. Command studies these reports carefully. There is no rush to celebrate, no declaration of reversal. Instead, attention settles on a quieter question: why simplicity succeeded where complexity failed. The tactic requires no new equipment, no superior engine, no advantage in speed. It relies instead on structure, coordination, and denial. The realization is unsettling because it implies that the imbalance was never absolute. Engineers, too, take notice. For years, performance charts and specifications have driven design: faster climb, tighter turn, lighter frame. Now, those priorities are reconsidered in light of survivability and mutual support. Durability, visibility, and fire coverage gain renewed relevance. The lesson is not that agility is unimportant, but that it is incomplete without context. Doctrine adjusts cautiously. There is resistance to sweeping conclusions, an awareness that one tactic does not solve every engagement. Yet language begins to shift. Emphasis is placed on formation integrity, overlapping fire, and disciplined rotation. What was once an improvisation at altitude becomes a subject of deliberate study. Adaptation, when it comes, arrives incrementally. Among the pilots, memory lingers differently. They do not recall victory as a moment of dominance, but as an act of restraint. The instinct not to chase. The decision not to break formation. The discipline to trust others with their survival. These choices, repeated under pressure, are remembered as decisive in a way that speed never was. The Wildcat earns a quiet redemption. It is not transformed into a superior fighter, nor reimagined as a masterpiece of design. Instead, it is understood more honestly as a machine that, when used correctly, could deny the enemy his assumptions. Its value is no longer measured by comparison alone, but by function within a system. Victory, as it is now understood, remains conditional. The enemy adapts. New aircraft are coming. The margin can vanish as quickly as it appeared. What has been gained is not control of the sky, but access to it, a recognition that outcomes are shaped by thought as much as by metal. As the smoke clears, one truth remains. The balance did not shift because the Wildcats became something they were not. It shifted because belief gave way to observation, and observation to structure. What follows will not be guaranteed, but it will no longer be assumed. In retrospect, the tactic reveals something fundamental about combat that statistics alone rarely capture. It privileges cooperation over brilliance. No single pilot could have achieved the same result alone. There is no moment of individual mastery, no heroic maneuver that turns the fight. Success emerges only when four aircraft behave as one, each accepting limitation as the price of collective strength. The innovation does not arise from abundance, but from constraint. Lacking speed, climb, and agility, the Wildcats are forced into honesty. They cannot pretend to be something they are not. In that honesty, invention becomes possible. The Matchstick is not clever because it is complex, but because it accepts reality and works within it. Limitation, rather than advantage, becomes the catalyst for change. Technology, exposed in this way, is revealed as incomplete without thought. Performance figures promise outcomes, but they do not dictate them. An aircraft's true value is not found solely in what it can do in isolation, but in how it shapes behavior, its own and its enemies. The Wildcat does not defeat the Zero by surpassing it, but by refuting the terms under which superiority was defined. As these encounters accumulate, the Zero's legend begins to fracture. Not collapse, not disappear, but crack. The aircraft remains dangerous, formidable, and lethal. Yet it is no longer unquestioned. Its invincibility proves conditional, dependent on opponents behaving as expected. Once those expectations are denied, the legend loses coherence. Faith, once enough, now requires reinforcement. War, in this sense, rewards those who observe longer than they assume. The Matchstick is born not from sudden insight, but from patient attention under pressure. Pilots watch what the enemy does repeatedly, not what doctrine says he should do. They listen more than they act. In that listening, they discover leverage where none seem to exist. The idea itself is almost unimpressive when stripped of context. For aircraft covering one another, rotating together, holding formation. It lacks the drama often associated with innovation. and yet its effects ripple outward, influencing tactics, training, and design philosophy. The smallest ideas, applied consistently, alter the largest systems. What the matchstick ultimately means is not confined to aviation. It speaks to a broader truth about conflict and adaptation. Superiority invites complacency. Disadvantage demands creativity. When one side believes too deeply in its own conclusions, it leaves space for the other to redefine the problem entirely. This is not a story of reversal through force, but through refusal. Refusal to chase. Refusal to scatter. Refusal to accept the logic imposed by an opponent's strength. The Wildcats do not win because they are better machines. They survive, and sometimes prevail, because they think differently, together. As the war continues, new aircraft will arrive, faster and more capable. The matchstick itself will fade into history, absorbed into broader doctrine. But its lesson endures. In war, as in all systems shaped by belief, dominance is rarely overturned by imitation. It is undone by the smallest ideas that refuse to behave as expected. The war does not pause to acknowledge moments of insight. It moves forward, absorbing lessons without ceremony. New fighters arrive, faster, stronger, armed with engines and weapons shaped by accelerating industry. Yet within these machines live ideas born earlier, under harsher conditions. The pilots who inherit them may never hear the term matchstick, but they practice its logic instinctively: mutual cover, disciplined spacing, refusal to isolate. Desperation, once local and improvised, becomes embedded. What began as a necessity hardens into doctrine. Not as a trick to be admired, but as a principle to be applied. Training emphasizes formation integrity. Tactics prioritize denial over pursuit. The air war matures, less enchanted by spectacle, more attentive to structure. The matchstick no longer belongs to 4 Wildcats in one corner of the Pacific. It becomes part of how survival is understood. For those who lived it, the lesson carries into peace. Survivors remember not the exhilaration of victory, but the restraint that made survival possible. They recall the discipline of holding formation while instinct demanded escape. The trust required to let another pilot guard their blind side. These habits do not vanish with the war's end. They persist quietly, shaping how risk is understood long after the engines fall silent. History, however, has its preferences. It records machines more readily than moments of insight. Aircraft specifications are preserved. Kill ratios are tabulated. Names are attached to designs and victories. What is harder to capture are the seconds when someone chose not to chase, not to turn, not to believe what had always been believed. These moments rarely survive the archive. The Wildcats were never superior aircraft. They did not outclimb, outturn, or outpace their enemy. They were heavier, slower, and constrained by design. Their advantage lay elsewhere, in adaptation, in the willingness to accept limitation and build structure from it. They survived not because they disproved the Zero's strengths, but because they refused to grant them relevance. Arrogance, in the end, proved heavier than armor. The belief that superiority could not be questioned shaped decisions long after conditions had changed. Confidence, once earned, became inertia. Against an enemy who no longer behaved as expected, it offered no protection. What failed was not technology alone, but certainty. There was a time when the idea seemed laughable. For aircraft rotating defensively against faster, more agile fighters. It looked passive, inelegant, temporary. It contradicted everything doctrine promised. But laughter depends on assumption, and assumptions are fragile things in war. They laughed at it once. They never laughed again.